Thank you. Hey. Well, it's good to see some friendly faces out there. I talked to Chris, and by the way, a great catch for Spy Museum is to have Chris, a very distinguished career in public service in his own right. So Chris, it's great that you're here. I've been doing the book tour thing, did a 2-week death march around 6 cities, and culminating in Dallas in my hotel room. I did 17 consecutive radio interviews from 7:10 till 11:40 with about 2 breaks. So I went out to the airport and had a drink after that. Anyway, I thought in the interest of what has been the template or pattern across my travels is just dispense with the spiel and just go right to questions and answers. And I think we got mics out there. I'm happy to give a long tutorial on the book, but I think what seems to work better with audiences is just Q&A, and it always takes the first one to break the ice. So,
thank you for your service, sir, and thank you for writing the book. With regards to cybersecurity, spying in China, for instance, and the role of multinational corporations, about how intellectual property is essentially just scooped up and weaponized or whatever. Where do you see multinational corporations and their roles and responsibilities? Can you reflect on that and progressing it 10, 20, 30 years down the line, as opposed to just straight up state actors and non-state actors?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by multinational corporations. If you're talking about Chinese corporations like ZT and Huawei.
Yes, sir. Also, with regards to, say, Facebook or Amazon having to go to these other countries and essentially share their...
Well, the bigger issue for me with the social media providers is need for regulation. We set up the Federal Communications Commission in the 1920s to regulate radio and later television. We have nothing comparable for social media platforms. And as I think, at least the takeaway for me after watching testimony of the executives from these companies, that they will only go so far in policing themselves. And I think they need regulation just like television radio does. I'm not sure I can respond beyond that. And intellectual property theft by the Chinese is a big industry with them. I will say the Obama administration, September 2015, did reach an agreement of sorts with the Chinese. This was on the heels of the OPM breach. And at least for the rest of the time I was in the government, the administration, they seem to have moderated their behavior, although I get the impression now they've sort of relapsed to their prior behavior. Regulating international companies is a tough thing. In the absence of cyber norms, which we don't have, there's been work done by the United Nations on this. It's going to be very difficult to regulate international or global companies. It just is, unless you have some unanimity among the nations who are affected or participants. That's going to be very difficult. In the back.
Hey, thanks very much. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Mark Stout from Johns Hopkins University. I used to be the historian here at the Spy Museum as well. And I just bought your book, really looking forward to reading it. But I noticed that, as is often the case with Washington memoirs, you get to stratospheric levels in your memoir real early in the book. And I'm always very interested in how people who've risen to senior ranks in this business sort of got where they got. So I guess my question for you is, what was your favorite intel job before you became a general officer? And do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure there was stuff that you would have loved to have written, but the publisher said, "Don't even bother. We're gonna take it out." So do you want to
Well,
talk a
not
little
the
bit about
publisher
that?
so much as the publication review process. Although the publisher did cut 20,000 words out of the original manuscript, and then we got Trey Brown, my collaborator, without whom I'd never written a book, by the way. We got it back, we never noticed. So there was, it was a good edit. So that, just a lot of words is not necessarily a measure of quality. I think, looking back, the favorite job I had before I became a general was my second tour in Southeast Asia. And I went back to, I was actually based in Thailand at a godforsaken place called Nakhon Phanom, which is right on the Mekong River across from Laos. And I was a young captain, had about 8 years commissioned service, and I was a commander of a signal intelligence detachment, about 100 airmen, that flew on the back end of EC-47s. These are old DC-3 type aircraft that were converted into airborne radio direction finding. And the objective was to fly along and try to get lines of bearing on enemy transmitters, in this case North Vietnamese Army targets that were moving through Laos, and try to find their locations. And it was a great job because, I was unit commander and I was flying. Because of the weight limits on the airplane, the only way I could fly was to get checked out as to do an enlisted person's job, which I was happy to do, honored to do. So I flew as an airborne analyst and flew 73 combat missions. But the reason it was such a satisfying thing for me, and I probably never experienced this again in the military, was when I got there, the unit was on its backside. It was a TDY, temporary duty thing, and the units, the main distinction of this small detachment when I got there was it had the highest VD rate on the base at Nakhon Phanom. So one thing the troops had excelled at was outreach to the community, obviously. And every other measure, it was in a bad place. And so it was my good luck that the IG shows up from the old Air Force Security Service Regional Headquarters in Hawaii. This old wizened colonel, and it was awful. We got Fs and everything. And he pulled me aside and said, "Don't worry about it. Think of it this way. You got nowhere to go but up." So I just took that IG inspection as a checklist, and we worked away at it, and I started getting in PCS, permanent troops, and I'm really proud to say that 100-man detachment, airmen, 13 of them made E9, Chief Master Sergeant, one of whom later became Chief Master Sergeant of Air Force Security Service, or one of his other many names. And our mission accomplishment rate went up, our fix rate went up, and fixed the maintenance. We got new vehicles and new barracks and all that sort of thing. And at the end of it, my tour, about a month before I left, that same IG came back, and we aced the IG inspection. And I'll never forget the feeling the day I left, the 3rd of June, 1971. And I remember thinking to I went to work and ran through the message traffic and all that, and my driver was taking me to the aerial port to take the Freedom Bird back to the United States. I remember thinking to myself, it didn't matter what my report card said or whether I got a hero medal or not. I just knew I'd done something. And it was a tremendous feeling of accomplishment that certainly I never really experienced later on. Yes, over here.
Thank you so much.
Please wait for the mic.
We got a mic coming right behind you. Right behind
We
you.
need you for the video.
Oh, all right. Thank you for your service, General Clapper. What I'm curious about is the Israeli companies, intelligence companies that we're learning about now, Wikistrat, Psi something or other. PSY something, Black Cube. Are these, what is the connection, if any, between these companies and the actual government of Israel. And do you foresee any problems with companies like this operating in this gray area?
Yeah.
I mean, can you
Well,
answer any of that? Thank you.
First, I don't know the answer to the question, is there a connection? I have a long association with Israeli intelligence, for which I have great respect. They have tremendous capabilities, and they're a great intelligence partner. And so I'm not aware, through that experience, not aware of certainly any formal coordination or interaction between Israeli intelligence community and these private companies. They are, and we have private intelligence companies in this country too. And I think one issue that as a citizen you'd be concerned about is, of course, they're not subject necessarily to the same oversight regimen that the government intelligence community is. So that to me is bothersome. And you hear if the stories, if they're true, and I don't know anything about this, but this probing of Colin Kahl and his family, which it's kind of disturbing and scary. Here.
Thank you for coming, Director Clapper. I just had a question. So you served as the fourth DNI, and you had 3 predecessors who have somewhat conflicting legacies. I just wanted to ask, what do you think was your lasting impact on that role, and where do you see it going? It's it was a role that was previously filled by the DCI, and how do you see the role moving forward, especially in this new age of sort of unified intelligence community?
Well, I remember at one of my farewell town halls before I left, and somebody asked me, what do you feel was your greatest accomplishment as DNI? And I said, I lasted a long time. And actually, there's something to be said for the continuity and stability. The first 3 DNIs were there a total of 52 months, so it was pretty much a lot of turnover. In fact, Senator Bond at my confirmation hearing in July or August of 10 said something about when Senator Feinstein called on him to speak. He said, well, welcome to our annual DNI confirmation hearing, sort of thing. Nothing like getting off to a good start, setting the tone for the hearing. But I do think there was great strength in me or anybody else, but just the fact that my superb deputy, Stephanie O'Sullivan, and I were there together for 6+ years. And the stability, I think, that brought to the staff of ODNI first, and secondly to the intelligence community was a big thing. I do think, you think about the history now, we had 9/11, so let's reorganize. Was that really the problem? I don't know. But the 9/11 Commission felt that there was a need for having a full-time senior official to promote integration, collaboration, coordination between and among all the intelligence elements. And having watched up close and personal 20 or 25 years worth of DCIs, Directors of Central Intelligence, who also were had the first hat as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, I will tell you that my observation is that, with one exception, sooner or later, mostly sooner, DCIs got consumed with agency-centric issues, which is quite understandable, having done 2 agencies myself for almost 9 years. Those jobs are in themselves all-consuming 7x24 jobs. So I don't think it's sufficient to have, like, somebody, part-time help at the post office at Christmas time, oh yeah, now it's my time to run the community. So I do think there's merit in having a separate official whose full-time job is to champion integration, cooperation, and coordination, because it won't happen unless there is somebody that's doing that. And so, this is a never-ending journey integration, but Where it'll go in the future, I can't say, but I do think that I felt, not to blow smoke on myself, but I do think it's important to have, for the way our U.S. intelligence community is organized and operated, that there be a full-time champion for that, and that that person have the levers to exert influence over the community.
Who was the exception?
Oh, thank you. Bob Gates was the exception for me. Bob served as the DCI director of CIA during my time as director of DIA. And the reason that he was able to balance his responsibilities between CIA and the community was because when he walked in the lobby at OHB, he didn't say, gee, what's this outfit do? Because he'd worked his way up. He was very familiar with CIA already, so he was able to better balance his time. So as a matter of fact, I tried to model what I tried to do as DNI based on what I had observed in the way he managed and led the intelligence community as DCI. So thanks for following up for me. At my age, I need all the help I can get. Yeah. Whoops, I'm sorry. I guess she who has the mic.
Yeah, it's like the spoon. I'm to say thank you for your service and out of uniform. I have to read my question because I get nervous. Having been both, how do you...
I get nervous when I give the answer.
Well, this is an opinion one, so it's probably easier. Having been both, how do you feel about current or recently retired generals serving in leadership roles or cabinet positions in our civilian government?
Well, that's an excellent question, and frankly, it's a bit bothersome. This may seem strange from somebody who spent 34 years in the military, but one of the things that we all, anyone served, knows that the abiding principle of civilian control of the military. And so, this is in no way to indict any or criticize any of the senior officers that either have or are serving in those positions. But I just think too many of them is not good because I think they should be civilian. I thought H.R. McMaster, who's a superb officer, was in an impossible position on active duty in the Army and then serving in having watched up close and personal three national security advisors during my time as DNI, that's a highly politicized position. And so I just think for the sake of preserving, protecting, and sustaining that principle of civilian control of the military, it's not a good thing. Having said that, thank God for Jim Mattis. And he certainly, they all do, all of us understand that principle. Okay.
Thank you for your service. I'm Linda Herod. I have 40 years at the CIA. And I'd like to get your thoughts on the negativity coming from the White House regarding the intelligence community, specifically the FBI.
Well, obviously, it is not good. I've spoken to this, as have others, about the harm this does to repeatedly bash these great institutions that we have in this country, and notably the FBI, which I think is a superb organization. There's great men and women in the Bureau, and got to know it pretty well through, Bob Mueller's time as director, and then certainly Jim Comey. And in fact, we took to calling, instead of the big 5 intelligence agencies, the big 6, because of the FBI's huge contribution, not only to law enforcement, but to national security. And so that's one of the reasons when, I sort of got off to a bad start with then President-elect Trump when he referred to the intelligence community as Nazis, and which caused me to call him. And amazingly enough, he took the call. This is on about the 11th of January. I had, what I had to lose had 9 days left, but and I tried to impart to him, in the case of the entirety of the community, that he was inheriting a national treasure in the form of the intelligence community, to include the FBI. And that the rank and file men and women of the community, many of whom serve in hazardous places and take great risks to keep this nation safe and secure, and that they were committed to providing as much information and as accurate information as they possibly could to help him make all the tough decisions that he would have to make as president. And then when I learned that the first place he was going to visit after the inauguration was CIA, and I thought naively, gee, maybe I got through to him. Well, I was wrong. So this is not good. And this is one of the motivations or catalysts for my deciding to write a book, which I wasn't going to do until I became very alarmed about the assaults on our values and institutions, both internally and externally, by the Russians. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try to do my little part to try to, educate people. So it's not a good thing, and characterizing the bureau as in tatters and all this sort of thing is not good. To do this over time, repeatedly, is not good for morale, obviously.
I'm going to read a question for
Okay.
someone from the audience. Based on the title of your book, Facts and Fears, how would you recommend the average American differentiate the two? And also, what would you say was your biggest failure in your career? What did you learn from it? And finally, what advice did you provide your successor, if any?
Well, I did the 3 envelopes in the drawer thing. Yeah. That's a lot of questions. Take them one at a time.
All right, here we go. Based on the title of the book, Facts and Fears, how should Americans differentiate between facts and fears?
Well, one thing that's not exactly the connotation of the title. It's drawn from a famous quote of General Patton's, which I'll paraphrase basically, and it was a sort of battlefield philosophy about, you're going to make a big decision in a battle context where obviously lives are at risk, and there are many, many fears that you can conjure up about making a decision, but just gather all the facts, then put your fears aside, make the decision, go on. So that was kind of the context there. I think maybe what the question implies, though, is, how people should attempt to discern fact from non-fact, or fact from alternative facts, or now truth is relative. That's an interesting formulation. And I think wherever you are, whether you're in the intelligence community or any place else, I think the focus on facts to the best of our ability to come up with them is really important. And so I think it's getting back to the question about the social media platforms. I think labeling the sources of ads, who pays for ads, for example. Did this come ultimately from the Russian government or someone asking on behalf, paying for the ad on behalf of the Russian government? It would be useful to know. And so people, and it's hard because on one hand, all the marvels of technology, which just inundates us all with information constantly. And so everyone has, individually, you have a task, the challenge of discerning what is credible and what isn't. And that's a hard thing. There's no silver bullet, no magic formula that I can suggest other than just to call out the fact that that's a challenge in our society today. And what was the next one?
The next one was your biggest failure. And
Oh my God, I had
what
so
did you
many.
learn from it?
Lots of, and by the way, I lay them all out, warts and all in the book. Lots of mistakes I made. I think the Diane Sawyer episode in December of 20, where she caught me cold on something I just didn't know anything about, and of course, the infamous exchange with Senator Wyden, which big mistake I made, which I've certainly freely admitted. didn't lie, but I made a mistake. So yeah, that was a failure, I guess.
So did you learn to not talk to other people? What, no.
Did I what?
Did you get any learnings from those? That was part of the question, if you learned anything.
Well, sure. Yes, I learned. I hope I don't do that again. You know.
Fair enough. And lastly, I think you may have answered this. Any advice to your successors?
Well, Dan Coates is not steeped in intelligence, and he's the first to admit that, but he is a good man, has the right values and the right instincts. And so, the community is, I think, fortunate to have him, and I hope he hangs in there.
Great, thanks.
General Clapper, thank you for your service to the country and to the government. I have a copy of the latest Time magazine, and you and Mr. Hayden are featured in there, having been interviewed. And the focus of the article seems to be a lot on the erosion of public trust in government. And the article concludes with saying that you prescribe more candor, and the intelligence community was not being sufficiently transparent and open. That's a quote from you. So lesson learned, early communication and more transparency.
Right.
I'd like you to expand on that, if you would, please, about early communication, especially transparency in an institution that needs to keep its secrets.
Well,
and then, but also finally, lesson learned, have we?
And this kind of relates to the previous question about mistakes and all that. I think the biggest takeaway for me in the aftermath of the Edward Snowden revelations was the need for the community, intelligence community, to be more transparent, to try to be more open, try to explain what the intelligence community does and why it does it, how it does it, and how, importantly, how it is overseen. And I'm convinced that, the most controversial thing that he exposed was the metadata storage program by NSA. And by the way, a program that came out of 9/11, where we didn't have a way of monitoring communications between foreign communicants and those in the United States. So that it was set up directly for that reason. And of course, the metadata always have to make the point that it's only, phone numbers and the length of the call, no content, no names. But anyway, that was exposed, and I think the whole business was, when it was, and the manner in which it was a huge shock to the American public. And of course, the hyperventilating, the hyperbole, the narrative that developed, that, NSA was listening to every phone call of every American and reading everyone's emails, which of course is absurd. But that's the narrative that got out there, and it was really hard to beat. I'm convinced that had we, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, probably could have got legislation you could drive a truck through that would have, permitted that legislatively and been open about it. And I believe that most Americans wouldn't be any more hinky about that program than they are about the fact that the FBI maintains millions and millions of fingerprint files on innocent people. But it's understood how it's used and the oversight of it. And I think it would have been in the same place with the Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which is what governed that program, had we been more open about it. Now, having said that, transparency is a two-edged sword, because to the extent that we feel obliged to regain or sustain the faith, trust, and confidence of the American people, and by being more open and more explanatory about what we're doing, adversaries go to school on that very same transparency. So we made a lot of risk-gain judgments about what to declassify, what to expose, and we did put out thousands of documents on the operations of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which we could do, and I think that approach has continued. The ODNI has an office that's specifically dedicated, full-time Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency Office. We renamed it to include transparency. promulgated principles of transparency throughout the intelligence community. But again, intelligence is inherently a secret business. And so there's always going to be an aura of suspicion and mystery, because everything we do cannot be like the Department of Agriculture or Department of Commerce, where for the most part you can be transparent about what's going on. And just the inherent nature of intelligence. So we're always going to have this aura of suspicion, always going to have some distrust, because we can't be necessarily fully transparent.
One over here.
Thank you, sir. Colonel Magne from the Norwegian Embassy. I'm a military attaché up there. I served 3 years on the Russian border. And how do you feel, from your perspective, how dangerous is Russia today?
Well, I have characterized, thanks for your service, and your country is a tremendous partner with the United States, and I have many friends yet today in your country, and I just want to make that point. When I'm asked about this, I say my response is short term. I think our greatest threat, external threat, is Russia, and will be for at least 6 more years as long as Putin's around. And it could be longer if he contrives some other way to stay in office. And this stems from, his personal animus towards the United States and what we stand for. And this goes back to his KGB time. He characterized the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he holds us responsible for that. That we, the United States, particularly in the aftermath of the fall of the wall, dissed Russia and Russians. And he has unswerving commitment to undermining this country and what it stands for. And of course, in a military context of concern to your country and others, is the direct military threat that the Russians pose to Europe. So again, short term is Russia, longer term is China, for a couple of reasons. One, their growing economic power. Secondly, their scientific and technical prowess, and what they don't have, they'll steal. And their impressive and disturbing military modernization program as well. So the one difference is, of course, what I think does serve to moderate Chinese behavior is the fact that our economies are inextricably bound, unlike Russia, where we were essentially mutually exclusive, just as we were during the Soviet era.
Sir, I want to ask about your leadership vision in this context. If you went back in time to your favorite duty station in Thailand as a young junior officer, how would you coach yourself about leading people effectively? How would you coach yourself about leading people effectively?
Well, and I tend to do this to explain that a little bit in the book. One thing about writing a book is, which by the way I'll never do again, that's one lesson I learned, but it is an opportunity. It was both a cathartic and it afforded an opportunity to be contemplative. And I'll just say that if your dad, particularly, is still alive and you're on reasonably good relations, hug him. Because I didn't realize until pretty late in life, after my dad was gone, how much impact he had on me. Specifically, just growing up in a SIGINT family, if you will, because he was a signal intelligence officer in World War II and then stayed in the Army after that for 28 years in the signal intelligence business. And just watching the way he dealt with people. He never preached sermons to me about it or never gave me lectures or anything. It's just the way he did that. And he imparted to me that in the intelligence business, it's true in other professions as well, but in the intelligence business, leadership is all about, boils down, in my view, to motivating people to use their intellects beyond maybe what they thought they could do. And I saw that in him. When I was in high school, my last year of high school, I was in a dependent high school in Germany. And so We were at a little SIGINT base in West Germany, and I was 17, 18 years old. So the soldiers that that worked for him were not much older than I, and I got to know some of them. And just the way, and they weren't trying to, suck up or anything, but just the way they talked about my dad and how he handled people and treated everybody fairly and with kindness. And I thought that sort of became the right approach. Interesting experience I had after my tour in Thailand. I was being mentored, which is another important thing, and the then commander of the Air Force Security Service planted me in the heady reaches of the front office of the National Security Agency. And I got to work for two different directors. And they're both dead now, so I can talk about them. The first one, Vice Admiral Noel Geiler, so I was there for the last year of his time as director of NSA. And I was still a pretty young officer, and I was his military assistant. So I, sat out in the outer office outside his office and got to watch him. And he was famous in the Navy as the senior aviator, the Gray Wolf, I guess they call it, and 3 Navy crosses from World War II. Really great exploits. He was very smart, very arrogant, and very demanding, and had a vitriolic temper. And so people were, I watched this, just sitting there kind of watching the dynamics. People very reluctant to bring in bad news. All the GS-18s, they jockeyed for ways to avoid talking to them. Not a risk taker. If something went wrong, boy, somebody's going to get fired. I can still remember women analysts running down the hall in tears, having where he fired him on the spot because of briefing he didn't like. So he left after a year, got his 4-star, went on to be Pacific Command commander. He was replaced by Air Force Lieutenant General Sam Phillips, famous for being the Apollo program director, rescued the Apollo program, and managed the program when we sent a man to the moon. Directly 180 out from Admiral Geiler. He was quiet, reserved, never raised his voice, gentleman, courteous. People then became in the mode of, they were mortified if they disappointed him. And he was willing to try new things. He'd listen. It wasn't a case of people were reluctant to give him bad news. So this was a real leadership laboratory for me, just working for Admiral Geiler, who scared me to death, and General Phillips. Fast forward 20 years from that. This was 1971, 72, 73. 1991, I became a director of an intelligence agency, DIA, as Lieutenant General in the Air Force then. And I remembered those two leadership styles and tried to apply the positive lessons I'd learned from that leadership laboratory experience, if you want to call it that.
Our time is really short. We have 2 people that we have already made contact with, so we're going to do 2 quick questions.
Hi, sir.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. I just wanted to, one of the things that you had a lot of influence on that's sort of related to your last question was creating a more diverse intelligence community, particularly for women and the LGBT. Could you talk a little bit about how you got there, how you got to that point and the benefits?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, that was when I was this in the book. Got to plug the book. When I was young, first lieutenant, even younger than my second tour in Southeast Asia, before I went to Vietnam first time in 1965, I was brand new second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and somebody thought it'd be a really good idea for career broadening if they put me in the orderly room. Now, military people know what that is, but that's basically the office that manages military personnel. You know, their discipline, manage the barracks, the mess hall, motor pool, and all this sort of stuff. But it'd be a good opportunity for me to get out of the technical world for a little bit, although I hadn't been in it that long, and put me in this job. And so they made me the admin officer for this, and I got involved, and I was a summary court officer for an airman that was killed in a bar fight. You know, it was kind of interesting because I had to take care of his effects and deal with his family and all that. And then I had to process, I think they were either general or maybe even dishonorable discharges for 2 airman linguists, superb Russian linguists, who were outed in the barracks as gay. And I remember at the time, I mean, I'm just a cog in the machine, so I did all the paperwork, but I remember thinking at the time what a waste that was and how unfair it was. So fast forward to about this was 1964, and 1989 or 90, I became the Assistant Chief of Staff Intelligence for the Air Force, in other words, what's called the A2 now, the Senior Intelligence Officer in the Air Force. And I had a case come to me because I made past judgments on clearances of a civilian employee who had been outed and had his clearance suspended and probably was headed for his employment being ended. I had been at NSA as a colonel in 1980, 79 and 80. I was a wing commander there, and Admiral Bobby Inman, who's still an icon, still active, teaching at the University of Texas, was the director, and still regarded as one of the best directors ever of NSA. And Admiral Inman had learned of a cryptomathematician, very valuable cryptomathematician who was gay. And Admiral Inman struck a bargain with him: if you acknowledge your sexual preference to your coworkers and your family and all that, we'll keep you on at NSA, because he would have removed the alleged vulnerability for blackmail. And the employee agreed to do that. So I remembered that example, and I had a case where I decided to, if on the same conditions, to restore this civilian officer's clearance. Fast forward to 2014, and I spoke at a LGBTA summit at NSA in the Friedman Auditorium. And I spoke about, I wanted to do this because it was kind of, full circle for me. It was kind of atonement. So I told a story about the 2 airmen that I'd processed out for less than honorable discharges when I was a young lieutenant. And I told the story about the civilian whose name is Mark Roth. Mark was sitting in the front row in the theater, and I saw him, and he was weeping. And then I lost it. It was really a very, very dramatic and telling moment for me. A personal hero I have here, which I recount in the book, is Admiral Mike Mullen, who was former chairman of the JCS. And in about a 29-second statement before I think it was the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he spoke simply and articulately about what a huge injustice it was that people had to hide their identities in order to serve their country. And we made a lot of progress, which I hope isn't reversed, in letting people be themselves, identify themselves, but still serve.
And here is our last question.
Hi, General Clapper. Thank you for your service. I'm studying intelligence collection right now, and my question is, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the modernization of the Central Intelligence Agency, and specifically, what are the consequences, both positive and negative, of integrating the operational and analytical sectors of the agency?
So Greg Vogel, many of you may know Greg, is retired from CIA now, and he was the DO. Greg and I have a lot in common because we're both Marines. And so Greg was running the study group that was in the lead up to, that was done for John Brennan when he was director of CIA, about modernization or reorganization of the agency. So they came around to see me, give me the briefing, and I said to Greg, let me give you some fatherly advice. I did 3 agency-level reorganizations in my time. I did one at NGA, which worked pretty well because I was there for almost 5 years to see it through. I did 2 at DIA. The second one was designed to undo the ill effects of the first one. Speaking of mistakes I made. So organizations ain't all they're cracked up to be. And my view is that there is no such thing as a perfect organization. Wiring diagrams make people on the top floor happy, but there are all kinds of second and third order effects, particularly for people in the trenches, whenever you reorganize. But that said, I supported the effort to integrate, the 2 worlds of analysis and collection in CIA. I do think it's a better thing. What it does is actually mirror the way things are done at stations, because they were doing that anyway. So that's a good thing. The problem, though, which in any of these is when you think about it, and I'll use the DoD metaphor here, where you have the military departments responsible for organizing, training, and equipping, and then they supply combatant forces to the combatant commands, the warfighters, the unified commands around the world. The agencies in intelligence, when you think about it, sort of do the same thing, all within one organization. They organize, train, and equip, and they also do the intelligence metaphor, intelligence analog to warfighting. And the issue is, do you have enough resources to do both when you organize like that? So can you, because one of the important things that the agencies do, you hear the term stovepipe is a pejorative term. Well, those stovepipes are the home of the tradecraft. It takes certain unique skill sets to do SIGINT, certain unique skill sets to do HUMINT, certain unique skill sets to do GEOINT. And those agencies are the home of that tradecraft. And it's important that they have the wherewithal to generate, sustain, protect that tradecraft, because that's a great strength of the U.S. intelligence community. I think you asked me for the time of day, try to tell you how to build a Swiss watch, so I think time is up. Is that right, Chris?
Thank you very much. Yes, sir. We're going to wrap up now. So first of all, let me just thank the audience. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for your support to the museum, and thank you for your great questions. What we're going to do now, first, I also want to say, sir, of course, thank you very much for your insights. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for your courage in some of what you expressed today and some of what we'll read and discover in your book. So thank you very much for your long service and what you continue to do for the nation.